series as part of Neeti Manthan 3.0, the flagship event of CPPR. We are honored to host Mr. Anil Swarup as a distinguished chief guest for the day. Mr. Anil Swarup, prolific author and IAS officer retired. Mr. Swarup's career as a civil servant has been quite illustrious. Having worked in the IPS for about a year before joining the civil services, he started his career here in 1981. He has served in numerous capacities, most notably as a Coal Secretary, Education Secretary, Additional Secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat. He went on to become the Secretary to the Government of India. Mr. Swarup also engineered the Ayushman Bharat Scheme, National Public Health Insurance Scheme. A prolific author, Mr. Swarup has written quite a few thought-provoking works, drawing from his experiences. No More a Civil Servant, Not Just a Civil Servant, and Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant. As a strategic thinker and an innovative leader, he has won several awards and nominations, notably nomination as one of the policy change agents by the Economic Times 4 times, 2010, 2012, 2015, and 2016. He was selected as one of the 35 action heroes in India Today's 35th annual edition. He is the founder chairman of Nexus of Good, an initiative towards recognizing positive action and providing inspiration to society at large to replicate them. So now, without further ado, I request Mr. Anil Swarup to share his insights as our speaker for today. And after that, we will be following it up with an interactive session with the audience. So, sir, I now hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for those very kind words, and a very good morning to all of you. As I said, we try to understand as to why things don't happen in the government. You know, it's very easy to come up with ideas. If you go around the street and ask people, what should we do or what we could have done with regard to COVID, almost everyone would have come out with some solution or the other. The reason is very simple. It's very simple to have an idea. In UP, we call them Rai Sahabs. They have advisors. You know, they are advisors who won't have done anything in their lives, but they will come up with an advice because they know they don't have to implement it. Actually, national education policy is a classic example of Rai Sahab, where a brilliant document has been created without telling us how it would be implemented. So everyone is trying to understand how it could be implemented. I'll come back to the national education policy subsequently as an example of why things don't happen in the government. So listen to this carefully as I've tried to analyze. In order to make things happen, in order for an idea to fructify and sustain, it has to be politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, judicially tenable, emotionally relatable, and environmentally sustainable. Now, you must be wondering, what is this going on? Am I giving you a reason for things not happening in the government? No. I'm trying to understand why it don't happen and then try and explain to you how they can be made to happen. Mind you, a lot of it can be available to the private domain as well. Not all, but a lot of it. Because if you look at these 8 dimensions that I mentioned or 8 constraints that I mentioned, and if you work around them, then you can make things happen. And I'll explain to you how we try to make things happen in some of the domains. Unfortunately, in the government, also, they don't look at where things have happened in order to make them happen. They keep coming up with Make in India, G20 and all things, because we don't question them whether Make in India actually happened. We assume that it happened, and we'll discuss that. Now, we are also assuming G20 happened. I don't know what happened, but it happened. So there are fireworks coming every alternative day because we forget about the consequence of the previous fireworks, and hence things don't happen in the government. So let me take all these aspects one by one. I'm so glad we have what, 23? I've succeeded. 23 have opened the cameras out of 82. That's good percentage. I think 35, 40% people. I managed to persuade them to open the cameras. I'm hopeful that others will also do. After all, it's XLRI. Right. So an idea cannot work or sustain or scale in a country like ours if it is not politically acceptable. No matter how good an idea I may have, if you want to scale it at a national level or even at a state level, small ideas can work here and there. I'm talking of the national and state level ideas. Because we live in a democracy and we are proud of being a democracy, it has to be made acceptable. Now, I'm using the word made acceptable. It may not be acceptable to begin with, but if you couch it in a language, if you present it in a manner that the politician feels that it is beneficial to him, he will accept it. Now, take it to the private domain, and whenever you go to talk to somebody, you have to convey a value proposition to that entity or individual. If you have the skills to convey that value proposition to him, then the chances of it happening are much more. Mind you, I'm talking of a bureaucratic structure whereby hierarchy, if I ask somebody to open a camera, he'll open a camera, but he will not sustain opening that camera until he or she realizes the benefit of opening that camera. I have not been able to convey that to you. It may not be beneficial to you. So far, I've only conveyed to you that it is beneficial to me because I want to see your faces as I talk to you. Maybe over a period of time, I'll be able to convince you into believing that you also, oh, I'm so glad Archit Bhatt has opened afters to me. Thank you, Archit. I'm glad that you're smiling. So it's lovely to see smiling faces in cold morning here in Delhi. And that's why I want your cameras, because it gives me energy. I'm an old man, no? So I look for energy from you, youngsters like you. But you don't, I mean, at least 24 of them are allowing me to see their faces and smile and get energized. So an idea has to be politically accepted. Let me take an extreme example here. Oh, I'm so glad someone writes, unable to open my camera as I'm on road. Just learned of your session. Oh, communication gap. Oh, she just learned that I've started this. XLRI may note. Just told them that I'm taking a session. Wonderful. So I'm taking an extreme example. We all have our views on reservation. Okay. Now, my hunch is that if you do a referendum in the country, probably the referendum will be against reservation. Now, can any political party accept this idea? I don't think so. No political party would do that. Why am I saying that? When we work in the government or in any organization, we have to identify areas where you can move some distance. Don't start hitting your head against the wall. Napoleon said it, nothing is impossible. But if you are unable to do what is possible, you will never be able to achieve what is impossible. If you try and achieve the impossibles up front, then there is trouble. I keep telling my colleagues, focus on what you can, then that can will grow. If you're obsessed with what you can't or what is impossible, even what you can will not be able to do. Because you will gain confidence by doing things. In simple terms, it's called low-hanging fruit. You harvest those low-hanging fruit, you will get the confidence to go in for slightly higher-hanging fruit. And that's how it improves. I mean, all of you are Management Institute would know what Kaizen is all about. It's all about slow and gradual improvements. So even in case of political acceptability, and I had that personal experience outlined in some of my books, that if the politician starts believing in you, that here is a person who's talking sense, then probably he will believe in aspects which he would earlier not believe in you. I've seen that happen. I've worked with 2 chief ministers. I've worked closely with 2 prime ministers. Once they start having faith in you, and that faith doesn't get built by asking him to do something which he's not willing to do in the beginning. But if you are able to develop the confidence in that person or that institution, then they will start believing in something which they otherwise don't believe. So that's how it has to move. This second is social desirability. In the national context or in the state context, you may have a great political idea which is politically acceptable, but if it is not socially acceptable, either you convey it in a manner that it becomes socially acceptable, as has been done in a number of cases. But if you don't do that, you'll flounder. Take, for example, many of you would not have been born. Professor Pradhan may have been born then. In the mid-70s, when family planning was going on, at that point in time, it was politically acceptable, but perhaps not socially desirable, and hence led to the collapse of a government. Now, I'm giving these extreme examples to illustrate to you that if you're not conscious of the limitations within which work, we'll never be able to overcome those limitations. We can't keep cursing them. That's a data that gets given to you, and your job is to work around that data. And the data here is you have a certain thought process. When Dr. Ram Mohan Roy worked on abolition of sati, at that point in time, perhaps it was not socially acceptable, but he couched it in a language, he went around in such a manner that it came to be acceptable over a period of time. The idea of mentioning these limitations, restrictions, bottlenecks is not to dissuade you from doing it, but to be aware that these are the limitations, so work around them. So if you want to make an idea work in the long run, you have to make it socially acceptable. And the present government is very good at it. They are able to package those ideas in a manner that by and large, people come to accept it. The third is technologically feasible. Now, technology is evolving over a period of time. At some point in time, maybe that appropriate technology is not available in the region. I'll give you a personal example. When I became school education secretary, and before that, I'm digressing a bit just to bring in the context. When I was posted as coal secretary, Government of India, and since you are all from Jharkhand, you would understand the importance of coal. I didn't know much about the coal sector, so I asked a friend of mine, "Yaar, ye coal sector kaisa hai?" He said, "Gangs of Wasseypur dekhi hai kya?" So that settled the issue. I came to know what the coal sector was all about. And then we managed to sort out the coal mess from acute cost shortage to a time when we were toying with the idea of exporting coal to Bangladesh. And there was hardly much left in the coal ministry. So I used to go to the PMO and I kept requesting them, "Sir, wind up the Ministry of Coal. We don't require it." So probably either they got fed up with me or they were looking for the most illiterate, uneducated civil servant to be made Education Secretary, Government of India. And they found that in Mr. Anil Swarup. I was posted as School Education Secretary when I had no clue whatsoever in school education. I thought I was coming out of the dark dungeons of coal mines to the bright lights of school education. And to my utmost horror, I found that the mafias of school education were worse than the mafias of coal. In coal, all the mining was underground and the mafias were above ground. In education, all the mafias are underground, eating into the essentials of this society. So it was much tougher. But my illiteracy or my ignorance about education sector was going around. And as I mentioned, there are so many Rai Sahabs around. So, and they are very expensive ones. Some of them, Rai Sahabs who come from across the Atlantic because they can't live here in India. It's very hot in summers. So they come here only for advice and they are paid very heavily. They come here for advice and then they'll go back. So one such advisor who came from across the Atlantic and said, "Mr. Swarup, why don't you travel to England, Finland, Holland, Scotland, this land, that land?" So I asked him, "Have you seen motherland?" So he didn't understand that in the beginning, but ultimately he discovered. I said, "The good things happening in the country, let's learn from them." He gave me another advice. We were grappling with the shortage of teachers. He said, "Mr. Swarup, why don't you install smart screens in all the primary schools in the country and you webcast it from here?" Now, this fellow, I asked him, "Have you been to interior areas of the country and seen whether internet works there or not?" It may be working today. I'm talking of 6 years ago. So technology evolves. If you don't have the right technology at that point in time, no matter what the good ideas, whether socially acceptable and politically acceptable, socially desirable, it won't work. This is not to say that technology would not become available. Make that technology available. Now I come to the fourth point. And that's a very interesting one. हमारी तरफ यूपी में कहते हैं जेब में नहीं पत्ता चल दिए कलकत्ता. This is called financial viability. Unless you have the money to back an idea, even political acceptability will not. But this is not to say that if you have a good idea and if you are able to position it appropriately, you will get money. But you should be conscious of the financial requirement. And this brings me to the national education policy. It is probably the finest document on education. And as luck would have it, when I was education secretary, school education secretary, this policy was being formulated. And the chairman of the committee came to meet me, Mr. Kasturi Rangan. He asked me, "Mr. Swarup, what is your suggestion about policy?" So I made a statement which surprised him. I told him, "You are wasting your time." He was shocked. I told him, "I'm sure you will come up with a lovely document, policy document, but I would suggest keep the document only for 20-25 pages. Make out an action plan, clearly outlining what needs to be done, how it will be done, who will do it, by when it is done, detail it. Because in doing that, you realize the limitations of what you're recommending." Now, education policy politically acceptable because it's cleared by the cabinet. It's certainly socially desirable. There's no doubt about it. The ideas are absolutely amazing. It is technologically viable. It can be done. It's technologically feasible, whatever has been suggested. My problem is with financial viability. Where is the money going to come? Now, national education policy recommends 6% of the GDP to be allocated to education sector. My friends, so far since independence, maximum allocation as a percentage of GDP has been only 3.1%. I don't see that 6% will ever be allocated to education in this country for very practical reasons. Now, had he understood that point, had he looked at the financial viability part, if I were in the part of the committee, I would have suggested, okay, I would prioritize the recommendation and say, if 1% becomes available, do these parts. If 2% becomes available, do this part. And you could have prioritized and said. And secondly, I would have also worked out of increasing the resources for education. Can there be non-budgetary? Now, had they thought about it, they would have looked at the policy slightly differently, because I do feel that I will never have that money to implement the recommendations of the national education policy. And since many states approach me now and I find their problem, it's very good to say that we should have foundational learning. It's very good to say that we should have preschool learning. But where is the money? Money is not there. The ideas are there. Again, I'm giving you a slightly different example to illustrate that it is not necessary to have money upfront. But if you can create an idea where money gets drawn. I was doing a scheme called Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, which has now morphed into Ayushman Bharat. When we started this idea of providing health insurance to the poorest of the poor, not many felt that the money would ever be available for this scheme. I remember after the first 2 years of the scheme, in the third year, Joint Secretary Budget used to ring me up one day before the budget to ask me, sir, how much do you want for this scheme? And the number that I mentioned was included in the budget. It was just crazy, because once you demonstrate the efficacy of an idea, then money comes in. Money is not a permanent constraint, so to say, but money is certainly a constraint. You have to work in a manner so that necessary money becomes available. Otherwise, the idea may work, but it will neither scale nor sustain. So that's the point. Then I come to the next point of administratively doable. By administrative doability, I mean availability of human resources. You may have money, you may have political backing, you may have social desirability, you may have technology, but if you don't have the human resource, look at schools or primary healthcare centers, doctors. It's not that there's a shortage of funds for health now. Money is available, but you don't have doctors, you don't have paramedical staff. Now, I'm not going to the details of it. What I'm trying to say is, when you have an idea, then you must work out where and how do you get human resource. I don't know about the private sector as much, but maybe a similar situation may exist there, that someone may have a great idea, but you don't know where to get the human resource from. So human resource management availability becomes extremely, extremely important. I'm touching these issues. I can go into the details of it, but I'm touching this issue in order to generate a discussion thereafter. Then the next point is, how does judiciary look at it? Whether it is judicially tenable. Again, I'm digressing a bit. In a country like ours, where a Supreme Court judge holds a press conference against Chief Justice of India, is not held for contempt. You and I try and say a word, we'll be held up for contempt. Not only is he not held for contempt, he's made Chief Justice of India himself. And then there is a sexual harassment case against him. Imagine. And there is a compromise. How can be a compromise in sexual harassment case? Either the judge was wrong or the lady was wrong. If there is a complaint, either the complaint is right or complaint is wrong. If the lady ventured to complain against judge when there was no complaint, she should be hauled up. And if she was right, then the judge should be hauled up. No, there's a compromise. And lo and behold, that Supreme Court judge becomes a member of parliament. But I treat it as an exception. What I try to tell my colleagues, and I would like to tell you all, is whenever you come up with an idea, please examine it from the legal point of view, whether it violates the constitution, the law, the rules. Because if it does that, then no matter if it is politically acceptable, socially desirable, money is available, human resources available, it won't travel much distance. So it has to be judicially, legally tenable. Then the seventh dimension came up when I studied the farms legislation. I remember in year 2000, I wrote a similar paper, probably the first paper on how these mandis, these markets should be opened. Farmers should not be forced to sell their product in mandis only. So that was the first paper, which later on became these legislations. To my mind, barring a few exceptions here and there, they were good legislations. But unfortunately, in a very rare case, the government was not able to convey this value proposition to the stakeholders. So stakeholders become important. So whatever idea you have, if you don't take stakeholders on board, if you don't take them into confidence, then the chances of idea working become remote. It would be difficult to make things happen if the stakeholders are not taken on board and they are not made a part of the process of decision making. The contention here is that if you have a dialogue with all the stakeholders, you may still disagree, but the disagreement will come down. Again, I'll give you a personal example. When I was coal secretary, coal existed in all opposition route states. So we worked out a strategy on how to get them on board. You know, I could have, as Secretary Government of India, I could have convened meetings in Delhi, called everyone and told them to do this. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. So what I did, I mean, probably I was the only Secretary Government of India not holding any meeting with the state governments in Delhi. I used to go down to the state governments, sit with them, discuss with them, take the ideas, convey value proposition and get them on board. People ask me, what triggered this increase in coal production? I think this was one such effort, that instead of imposing your will on somebody, take the stakeholders into confidence, convey a value proposition, it will work. It worked. It worked brilliantly. So in case of arms legislation, perhaps it was not done. There was an attempt to rush through the bills in the parliament, and it created unnecessary suspicion, as a consequence of which there was opposition. And then it was too late to discuss with them. Then the bills had to be withdrawn. The last one was added very recently, perhaps thanks to COP28, environmentally sustainable. And having been coal secretary, you know, to me, it was very important, because I remember when I was coal secretary, a similar COP was held in Paris, and I was supposed to go there. And since I did not have insurance, I did not go there, because I would have been killed as coal secretary. I was the primarily responsible for all the pollution, and I was being asked to go to Paris. I didn't. So what happened? All these ABC, BBC, CBCs, all the television channels landed in Delhi, and they started questioning me. They questioned me that why is India increasing its coal production? I mean, it's easy to ask questions. That's the easiest thing. Each one of us is a journalist in that sense. We don't have to give any answers, but we can ask questions. Nowadays, of course, it's different. It's very difficult to ask questions. Not many journalists do that. But at that point in time, journalists did ask questions. They asked me. So I asked them a counter question. I told them, are you aware that India's per capita energy consumption on this day is equivalent to the per capita consumption in US in late 19th and early 20th century? What do you expect us to do? Remain in the dark age or burn trees? Unless you give me an alternative, what other option do I have? So when I talk in terms of environmental sustainability, we have to balance between the development needs and our environmental sustainability. So what do we do in coal? And since you all are in Jharkhand, you must go around and see whether this is actually happening or not. I'm talking of 8 years ago when I was coal secretary. At that point in time, we initiated something, and I'm told it's happening. For every hectare of land that is taken for mining, 2.5 hectares of land has to be forested. And this forestation is monitored through satellite. And that data is available. Now, what we really need to do is to see whether it's happening on the ground. So whereas it is important, it's extremely important to talk in terms of environmental sustainability, but we have to talk of development also. So that sort of a balance to be brought about. Now, I've very briefly given you a flavor of the 8 aspects in which I felt that things can be made to happen despite these 8 restrictions. Of course, there are other problems which you are not concerned directly with, which is the CBC, CBI, CAG, CIC, and courts, the 5 Cs that I have spoken about. On account of paucity of time, and not going into the details of it, you know, I have spoken for half an hour. I would have loved to carry on because that's the easiest thing to do. Talking is very easy. Walking is very difficult. I tell you with experience of 38 years. talking, talking, and talking. I love talking, but I'll stop here. What I'll do is I'll take questions from you. Let's reduce this to a conversation. And then maybe, if time permits, I'll talk more about what you as an individual can do in making things happen in India. But that will be very personal in nature, different from what I've said, related to what you can do in India. Because, usually it's our habit to blame the government, the society, the system. It's very easy to blame somebody else. उम्र भर यही भूल करता रहा गालिब, धूल चेहरे पे थी, आईना मलता रहा. तो you can keep blaming the mirror all the time. My effort during my career and even now has been to see खुद ही को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से कुछ पूछे, बता तेरी रजा क्या है. Can you evolve as an individual to be reckoned with? These days everyone seems to be talking about nation. बड़ा जोश है, समाज, सबकी बात कर रहे हैं. वो नेशन की बात करके अपने बच्चे को बाहर पढ़ने भेज देता है, वहां का सिटीजनशिप दिलवा देता है, फिर नेशन की बात करता है. So I keep telling youngsters like you, forget about nation and society for the time being, become a good citizen. And maybe if time permits, I'll suggest to you how you can actually become a person to reckon with, become a good citizen and contribute to the country and the society rather than merely talking about nation. So thank you very much. I've spoken for 30 minutes. Over to you. We'll have this interactive session. And I'm so glad the screen is full now. All 25 videos are open. Thank you very much. I have managed to make this happen, at least if nothing else.
Thank you so much. This was a very, all the insights that you gave for all of us. Most of us, we are from very different backgrounds. Very few of us are from government service as a background. So for us, your experiences, all the incidents that you're narrating are very unique for us. It's very offbeat compared to what we normally experience in conversations with each other or in class discussions. So now the audience, all of you are free to drop your questions in the chat box.
Or why don't you allow them to speak up if you can enable them to speak? They're all on silent mode. It would be better rather than somebody else reading on the chat box. Let me have a conversation with them.
As you wish, sir. So please.
Can you permit me to say a few words?
Of course, Mr. Pradhan, please carry on.
Indeed, thankful to Anil Swarup ji. I am Professor Pradhan, one of the oldest faculty in this institute for close to 30 years. So I should have retired like you and started writing a book. And I looked for your book. I didn't get a copy. It was e-copy, Kindle edition available. So, but somewhere in the internet, I found a PDF copy available. So I downloaded, and it was really interesting to read your book. And
which was that? Which one did you read?
This ethics.
Wonderful. Ethical dilemmas of a civil
Yes. And yeah, really interesting that you spoke to our students. We adore your time and for the times, Yeah, see, I understand that yes, you need to talk to stakeholders as a government, and it's okay. What I say is that stakeholders, you can convince your employees, your unions. You can go over to political parties to negotiate, or even state governments. So I think these are bureaucratic strategy that you adopt, and they are okay. But let me ask you one thing: that there is an emergence of non-market actors today, and I call these guys because the community and NGOs or civil society, and most importantly the media. So I think there are some media houses who do take government's words to the public, and maybe influences back government in many other ways. And these non-market actors are becoming extremely active. They are sensitive. Some good, but at times they are also coming against adoption of technology, development, projects which probably, you have seen Vedanta, you have seen Tuticorin projects, and you have seen the Mumbai metro. So all of these, there are significant. So how do you see this space emerging, and how you think that they can be channeled to positive contribution? Because I personally see at times they also go against the technology. I think the technology doesn't allow anybody to play around, and it has its own course. And these guys came so heavily and put such a big cost to Mumbai metro. And so also in many of the projects are stalled. So I just want your views as a civil servant, which you worked at so long, sir.
You are absolutely correct. These non-market actors are increasingly becoming pretty dominant, and they influence decision making. And I think this is a natural occurrence in any evolving democracy as we are. So you can't ignore them. So the attempt should be to see such areas where the principal actors or principal proponents have been able to convince them into believing in what they want to do. That's the trick. How have they done it? So I keep going back to the experience that I have had. Otherwise, it will be theoretical. Like in coal, when I became coal secretary, no one ever imagined that we would be comfortable at some point in time in coal production for the reasons that you are mentioning. There were environmentalists, there were adversary state governments. As I said, at that point in time, coal existed in only opposition ruled states. What could be worse than that? And then most rabid environmentalists opposing coal. I'm giving this example to illustrate, because if you read the book, the previous one that I wrote, Not Just a Civil Servant, where I explain that how such hindrances can be overcome in terms of making things happen. And if you learn from that, so I give a simple example to my colleagues, that if you sit in Delhi and hope to wish away the problems that are there in the state, they won't happen. So you have to strategize with each stakeholder. Let me give an example how we strategize with each stakeholder. And I'm thankful to late Mr. Arun Jaitley, who played a very prominent role in that. Now, I wish he were around today, because then the central government would not be firing salvos at state governments, but sitting with them and discussing with them despite political differences. So once you understand and try to understand these so-called adversaries and sit down and have a chat with them, we don't normally do that. We normally start by dumping them. No, I'm not saying this will solve the problem, but this has a better chance of solving the problem by sitting and discussing with them. So there were problems within Coal India, there were problems with environmentalists, there were problems with the state government, and we negotiated with each one of them. We discussed with them. I'll give you an example here. And we have to go into the details of every concrete example to illustrate how it can be done. If you give me a specific example, then probably after examining the why of that problem, I may be able to give you a solution. I am doing that post-retirement with a number of people, with a number of state governments. So what did we do? Mrs. Mamta Banerjee or Miss Mamta Banerjee was having a war with the central government. Even then. Now, I required land for 7 blocks for coal. How do I get that? Nothing could be worse than that. I'm telling you, all these metro are not as difficult as this one, because they're political, real adversaries. So what do? I find a soft spot. And that soft spot is the Chief Secretary of West Bengal, who's a year junior to me, Chief Secretary. I know him personally. So what I do, I tell him that I'm coming over to Calcutta to have a cup of tea with you. No, these are strategies that you have to work out. And I go with a half page of paper with me, some details written on. I meet him and show him this paper and tell him that the West Bengal government is losing per day so much royalty if you were to mine coal from here. So much way of direct employment, so much by way of indirect employment. I tell him that I could have written a DO to you, a letter to you, and you would have responded to me. Nothing would have happened. I've come here to have a chat with you. Now, you know the Chief Minister very well. Go and have a chat with her and tell her to keep politics apart. This is for your own state, you'll benefit. Now, I found that soft spot. I had to do some research. I don't know what happened. Within 48 hours, it is incredible. I got land for all 7 blocks. Within 48 hours. Why am I saying that? It is not that I succeeded everywhere. I did fail in some places. Like, for example, in Odisha, the MLA of the ruling party in Odisha was preventing mining of coal. Now, how do I do it? What do? I go to Odisha, speak to the Chief Secretary first, then seek time from the Chief Minister, have a word with him. And this could have failed. And he's a very patient listener. He doesn't respond much. So I explained to him, sir, we are losing out. We are unable to mine coal. And Odisha is losing so much money because you get royalty for the coal that is mined. What does he say? Call Chief Secretary and DGP. He doesn't say anything else. Chief Secretary, DGP arrive. And he looks at them and he tells Mr. Swarup has something to say about this MLA. He names him. He says, fix him. Problem over. Now, the point here is, if you look at the problem in its totality, then it becomes too huge for you. You have to analyze these problems. I'm not saying these approaches will work everywhere. In some places it will work, in some places it will not work. So you have to look at, these days I'm doing troubleshooting on behalf of a number of people, because what I do is analyze the problem threadbare, where is the problem, and then try and do it. We can't push it under the carpet. Mr. Pradhan, you are absolutely correct that these problems have existed and they will continue to become even worse. Now coming to NGOs, the tragedy is our biases against groups, like group bureaucracy, all are corrupt, private sector only making money. These are wrong biases that we have. I discovered during my career of 38 years, there are good, bad, and ugly people in every organization, in every institution. By condemning them as a whole, we are not taking any action to get things moving. Try and understand that organization and identify soft spots. What I discovered amongst NGOs, as school education secretary, I discovered and came to this conclusion that there are outstanding NGOs doing phenomenal work. Can I associate with them and help them scale their work? The whole idea of nexus of good, someone mentioned it, came from that. If all the rascals and the ruffians of the world can come together and make life difficult for us, why shouldn't good people come together? And there are good people in the private domain, there are good people in the NGO domain, there are good people in the government domain. The tragedy is our bias. Our bias is everyone in the private sector is only busy making money. Everyone in the NGO is corrupt, or they are making money. Everyone in the bureaucracy is corrupt and that's the bias we go with, and we don't find solution. If you understand an organization, you'll find soft spots. You'll find people. The trick is to identify such people and work with them. Again, it's not very easy. If it were easy, it would have happened. It takes a lot of time to understand people and work through them gradually. It took me a lot of time. Once you develop a reputation of person who get things moving, then Dr. Manmohan Singh will pick you up when there is a crisis in investment. Mr. Modi will pick you up to become co-secretary. In 38 years, I didn't go to a single politician for any personal favor. So you have to understand where the problem is, what is the reason of the problem, and then try and work through it. Again, as you rightly said, it's not very easy. There are problems there. Hope I partly answered your question.
Sir, you're on mute.
Just one. Can I ask a question?
Of course, sir.
Yes. Mr. Swarup, there is one question that I need to ask. I was teaching a course on public-private partnerships, and this was on steel. You have captive coal mines given to steel, companies, and there was one newspaper article that came that it is unfair. The newer steel companies that coming do not have access to captive coal mines, and it's an unfair competition between the steel companies. So there was one article in the newspapers that said mining companies should mine and sell it to the steel companies so that it's a level playing field. I read this newspaper article, and about a month later or something, TV Narendran, the MD of Tata Steel, came and said that that is not a good idea, because Tata Steel acquired Kalinga Nagar, which is right beside Jamshedpur. And when you go to a new place, like to set up a steel plant, there's quite a bit of opposition from the locals and things like that. So you are the government at that point in place. You have to set up schools, you have to set up roads, lighting, everything. So if you give it to a steel company, it will use it much more meticulously, preserving the thing. Whereas if you give it to a steel, mining company, it will mine and abandon the place completely. So this is one question on which kind of thing, what is your opinion on this?
See,
And
a similar situation. Okay, a similar situation exists in coal. Because you have a captive power plant and the captive mines, and now you have commercial mining for coal. To my mind, both are required, and you'll have to examine each situation as to which one is the best for the country as a whole. For example, in coal, I'm more familiar with coal than with steel. If I were to set power plants on the pit head, it would save me enormous amount of cost. So I would rather have a plant and transmit the electricity than transport the coal. Environmentally also, this is much
Absolutely,
better, right?
absolutely.
So from that point of view, it is there. However, in some cases, it may be required to set up coal plants or steel plants at different places where coal or iron ore may not be available. So in that sense, you have to have mines elsewhere. Now, these mines could be captive and otherwise. Personally speaking, I mean, this is again a personal view. I would not go in for captive mining overall, because as the steel miners rightly say, they are at a disadvantage. Either you, and that would be difficult to enforce, that a steel plant can only be set up with a captive mine. You package them and give them as is done in some of the coal sector plants, or you have an open, you also have availability of iron ore and coal, which is available in abundance, so that the price of the coal or the iron ore is not much at variance with the ore that is being mined by in the captive mines. So there have to be a balance between the two. It will be wrong to say that all coal mines should be so de-linked with the existing steel plants. No, because they have been set up close to the pit heads, close to the mining center to save on transportation cost. But you cannot have, especially in steel, because transportation of steel, finished steel, is pretty expensive. Transportation of power is not so expensive as compared to that. So these aspects will have to be looked into before taking a decision as to whether one should be allowed the other. My personal view is it has to be a combination of both.
Just one more question. I mean, the whole coal scam that I understand was on the FCFS, the first come, first served thing. So could you just explain, whether this was actually followed, or what
No, no.
exactly is
No, no,
FCFS?
No. First come, first serve was not in coal. First come, first serve was in 2G. Coal was a different allocation system. So my suggestion is, it would take me another hour to explain the entire thing. First of all, my take is that it was not a scam. There were irregularities done. There were wrongs done. But to call it a scam and talk in terms of what Supreme Court said, went on to cancel all the coal mines allocated even in the 90s, was absolutely scandalous. And I have written that in my book. If you care to read, not just a civil servant, there are 3 or 4 chapters on it, which provide the entire details of what actually went wrong and what was made to look wrong. In fact, I have come down very heavily on the then CAG.
No, I want to purchase all your books immediately.
They are available on Amazon if you want, and if you give me your address, I can have them sent to you also.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So now we can have Gande Bhavya. You can unmute yourself.
Yes. Sir, really lovely session. I enjoyed whatever you told, the 8 dimensions. But at the start, you told that हम लगता है कि Make in India हुआ है, G20 हुआ है, and I'm more curious about hearing what of these 8 dimensions that you talked about was not there, and why do you believe that हमें लगता है पर हुआ नहीं है?
See, if you study Make in India, the 2 primary objectives of Make in India were, number 1, increasing the component of manufacturing to around 25% in the GDP, and second, employment generation, both. Okay. We haven't yet had any evaluation, I don't know whether it consciously or otherwise, on whether these 2 objectives were fulfilled. The data that I have is, at the time when Make in India was launched, the contribution of manufacturing to the GDP was 13%. It actually came down to 12% after Make in India. So what are we talking about? Employment, I don't want to say much about it. It's a well-known fact what is happening on the employment front. So that's what. Now, what was the problem with Make in India in these 8 dimensions? Okay. The problem with Make in India was that they did not go into the why of manufacturing not happening. Let me elaborate it further. If you don't understand the why of component of manufacturing not increasing in GDP, you'll never find an answer. And how do you increase employment? So one of the biggest providers of employment in India is small scale sector, small and medium sector. I mean, totally ignored. No one seems to be talking about it. They are in serious trouble on account of variety of factors. I'm all in favor of GST. But the manner in which it is implemented virtually destroyed the small and medium sector. The variety of things that happened, Then the second sector is the real estate sector, which provides employment. These are the two major employment. There is no mention or discussion on this. So unless you go into the details of each, the why of it, you will not find an answer. G20, I'm still trying to grapple what is it left, apart from, hoardings which are still seen, big banners. I asked somebody, what happened to G19? What were the commitments made? And was there an evaluation paper on what was said in G19 was actually obtained? No one has it. It's not available in public domain at least. So what are we talking about? If we get satisfied with fireworks, it's fine. But if you want to talk of substance, let's talk of data. Where is that data? Right?
So, sir, as a follow-up, shouldn't we also have what we need to, when we are seeing what a project is or a policy is, we also need to include what are the key parameters that we need to look at, and at what stages do we need to reevaluate it as a government or whatever entity.
Absolutely.
So why don't we do that?
You are absolutely right. No, now I don't want to go into, I have a full session on policy formulation and implementation. I'll briefly mention it here. If you look at these successful policy implementations were these Swachh Abhiyan. We must understand why did it happen. The infrastructure development in the country, we must understand why did it happen. If we understand that, we'll understand how it can happen elsewhere. You have to look at the success stories. Look at the Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, which has now morphed into Ayushman Bharat. Scheme worked. I mean, I was instrumental in formulating, very rarely does a bureaucrat have an opportunity to visualize, conceptualize, articulate, implement, and evaluate a scheme. I had that. And that scheme is working well today in the name of Ayushman Bharat. Let's try and understand why did that happen. Once you look at the why of happening of it, you'll understand a why of not happening elsewhere. So that's what you look at. And you're right. Until we clearly identify the determinable outcomes and we evaluate that, how do we know whether it has happened or not? Okay, Shubham Baheti, if I pronounce your name correctly.
Yes, sir. So, sir, my question would be that how to deal with, for example, in your case, politicians, and in general, I wanted to ask that how to deal with people who have preconceived notion or their agendas to be set, and then you have to formulate a policy and pass them through it to make them understand things.
My friend, again, my next book is Encounters with Politicians, being released on 21st of January. It will answer all your questions. We have this habit, and I'm briefly telling you what the book is all about. We have this habit of blaming politicians for every wrong in the country. And I also did that in the first 10, 12 years and ran into serious problems with politicians. Then I understood their limitations. And believe me, I've had very sensitive assignments. In 90% of the cases, I was able to convince the politician to my side. 90%. After all, 10% I have to give it to him if he overrules me. He can't, we are expected to do everything on my behalf. There were very rare cases where I found I was unable to convince him. You know why? Because I put myself in his shoes. And the guideline was very clear to me. Number one, I will not do anything that is illegal against any law. I will not do it. And believe me, people talk to me, weren't you under political pressure? In last 20 years of my career, I was not under any political pressure whatsoever, despite holding such assignments. Why? Because in the first 15, 16 years of my career, I had developed a reputation, galat kaam karega nahi. To galat kaam kehta hi nahi tha. Then no one asked me for a wrong work, except one industrialist when I was coal secretary, and that industrialist appears to be in trouble now. He was the only person in 20 years to ask me for something which was wrong. That also appears in my next book. So what I am trying to say here is that, yes, politicians have their limitations. You must understand their limitations and work through them. The key point, whether in the private sector or public domain, is conveying an appropriate value proposition to the so-called adversary. Now, I understood the difference between compromise and accommodation. I would never ever compromise on law. But there is a huge gray area where we have to accommodate the politician, because I would accommodate my friend. I would accommodate my colleague. So why not the politician? So long as it was not against the law. And the politician brought to me enormous amount of inputs through which I could actually formulate fresh regulations which could enable anybody in that situation to be held. So I give you a concrete example here. When I was additional registrar cooperative banking, it was a highly political post. There used to be pressure on me to post husband and wife together. Political pressure. So when politicians came to me, I tried to examine it and I found what they're saying is genuine. Why shouldn't husband and wife, there should be an attempt to post them together. They'll be more productive that way. So I listed out, a particular regulation in which in certain conditions they could be posted together. Now this feedback actually came from a politician. Once this situation became visible, then no one went to the politician. They fulfilled that criteria and they were posted together. So as a civil servant, I'm sure in the private sector also, you have to evolve systems so that such interference gets reduced. It will not get eliminated. In a way, it is good also because democracy or politicians, they give you enormous amount of feedback that can be useful to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
So now next question from Mohini.
Mohini Singhal has raised her hand.
Hello, sir. So my
Can you
question
be slightly
is,
louder, Mohini? I am slightly
uh,
hard of hearing.
yes, sir. Hello.
Good,
There
I
are
can
not.
hear you now. Yeah.
Yes. So, sir, I was just recently talking to one of my friends who is in services. So, there he highlighted some of the issues which a new joinee might face. So, he's a very upright person, and let's say when it comes to, let's say, the departmental budgeting. So, he said that like in most of the cases, no particular budget as such is allocated for other expenses. Let's say politician is visiting the city for his own personal, I would say, own personal kind of engagements. And he would just organize a meeting, and then it's on the department to host everything. And then various other means are used to raise that kinds of funds to host him. So all these things happen, and then you face kind of a conscience pricking that you are not the right person to do this job. So when an MBA graduate, let's say, think of joining eventually these services, then they think that it's like that it would eventually always lead to a kind of a dilemma, and you won't be having a peace of mind if you join these services. So having worked here all these years, what would be your suggestion that whether
Okay.
it's the right choice?
Okay, Mohini, I would suggest if you read Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, there are 70 such cases there.
Okay.
And I slept with a peace of mind. How? There is an American monk by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr. He says, Lord, grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, courage to change things that I can, and the wisdom to understand the difference between the two. I often, because I interact with hundreds of young IAS officers, I'm in touch with them. And I keep telling them, अगर तुम्हें revolutionary बनना है तो झाड़ू उठा के political party join कर लो. In the service, you should try and do what you can. And I repeat what you can, and you can do a lot. For example, I tell my colleagues, has any politician ever asked you to come late to the office? आप उसकी बात कर रहे हो उसको treat करने की, but how many of us come to the office on time? Has any politician ever asked you to keep your office dirty? How many of us keep our offices dirty? Has any politician ever asked you to misbehave with a person or ask him to wait who comes to meet you? None. Yet I misbehave with people who come to meet me. I don't meet them. I keep them waiting. Once you start disciplining yourself, you will find that that can grow. As I said, no one had the courage to ask me to do a wrong thing in the last 20 years of my career. How did this happen? There are sacrifices involved either way. There are sacrifices. Don't try and change the system. Everyone is trying to change the system. The old man very correctly said, be the change you wish to see in the world. Don't try and start. Youngsters, I find, they want to change the world without changing themselves. They won't ask questions of themselves, whether as a subdivisional magistrate or a young officer, I am doing what I ought to do. They will start questioning others. वो नेता आ रहा है, उसकी देखभाल हो रही है, उसको खिलाया पिलाया जा रहा है. अरे आप क्या कर सकते हो उसमें? I will narrate an incident since we are coming too close to the time. My suggestion to all you youngsters here is focus on what you can. Don't spend sleepless nights over issues over which you have no control. I was in the police before I joined the IAS. So one of my colleague probationer, who was also an IPS officer, retired not very recently as Director General of Police. He was then young. He walked up to me and says, "Boss, रात को नींद नहीं आ रही." हमने क्या हो गया? Boss, पेट्रोलियम के दाम बहुत बढ़ रहे हैं. It could be anything, but he said good. So I said, यार हाँ दाम तो बढ़ रहे हैं, लेकिन क्या तुम्हारे रात को ना सोने से पेट्रोलियम के दाम कम हो जाएंगे? नहीं बॉस, देश की आर्थिक स्थिति पर कुप्रभाव पड़ रहा है. तो हमने कहा यार वो तो ठीक है, लेकिन ये मुझे बताओ तुम्हारे रात को सोने से इसमें क्या फर्क पड़ना है? चिंता के लिए ठीक है, चिंतन के लिए ठीक है, चर्चा के लिए ठीक है, रात की नींद क्यों हराम कर रहे हो? रात की नींद उस चीज के लिए हराम करो जिसमें कुछ कर सकते हो. देन ही अग्रीड विद मी, हाँ बॉस सही कह रहा हो. चला गया. 3 महीने बाद फिर आया मेरे पास, कहता बॉस रात को नींद नहीं आ रही. मैंने कहा क्या हो गया है? पेट्रोलियम के दाम तो अपने आप कम हो गए बिना तुम्हारे इंटरवेंशन के. कहता बॉस देश की पॉपुलेशन बहुत बढ़ रही है. मैंने उसको कहा रात को सो जाओ यार, अपने आप ठीक हो जाएगी. See the point that I am trying to mention here, and you all must understand this very clearly. You know, we see all wrongs around us and we feel very disturbed. That young, ask him to speak to me, I'll explain to him. And many of them do speak to me. It is nice to be conscientious, but don't try and correct the entire world. You correct yourself, and then your aura will grow. Wherever the organization, you know, it happens. I've seen it happen with myself. You become okay, you become good, you become efficient, you become honest. Then gradually people around you will start imbibing. It happens. आप क्या कर रहे हो? अरे वो नेता को आगे उसने क्या कर दिया यार, वो तो कर दिया तो कर दिया यार, क्या कर लोगे भाई? अरे हम तो बड़ा आजकल रात परेशान है, हम क्या इसके लिए सर्विस में आए थे? अरे भैया जिसके लिए सर्विस में आए थे, कोर्ट में बैठो, जजमेंट दो, जो आदमी आ रहा है उसका भला करो. तुम ये क्यों देख रहे हो यार नेता का क्या हो रहा है? आई एम नॉट डिनाइंग इट्स नॉट हैपनिंग, इट इज हैपनिंग. उनकी सेवा भाव हो रही है, कहां से पैसा आ रहा है. आई एम नॉट डिनाइंग इट. सी फ्रेंड्स, एज यंग फ्रेंड्स, focus on what you want. I mean, I learned it gradually over time. I remember I used to get very agitated in traffic jams. Very agitated. बाल, अब तो बाल नहीं है मेरे, बाल नोचता था. So one day my wife was traveling with me. I got stuck in a traffic jam. फिर मैं नाराज हो गया, क्या है? Then my wife asked me, कि तुम इनका कुछ कर सकते हो? मैंने कहा मैं क्या कर सकता हूँ? बोले तो कुछ कर नहीं सकते तो अपना खून क्यों खौला रहे हो? That's the point. Many of us get agitated over America attacking Iraq. हमने लोगों को लड़ते हुए देखा है. I mean, we should get agitated, but यार उसकी लिमिट होती है. उसकी वजह से आप घर का काम खाना बंद कर देंगे क्या यहाँ पर? So we should be very clear. I am very clear in my mind. You read ethical dilemmas of a civil servant, you will understand. Every step is a dilemma. After 15 years of my career, I had no dilemma in my mind. I was very clear. ये करेंगे, I'll pay a price. ये करेंगे, no dilemma whatsoever. You have to develop that clarity and tell your young friend, stop getting hassled about how Neta is being treated. That's how the world is. Don't try and change the world.
Yes, sir. And I think I will also now suggest him to read that book. Maybe that would resolve his all.
Many of them have been helped by reading that book. Yes, Shubham.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Good morning, sir, and thank you very much for the session. Sir, there was one question which came into my mind. Sir, you mentioned that for education, we have been allocating some portion of GDP, but what is suggested is around 6% or so, and we might never see that kind of allocation. And at the same time, we have policies like new education policy, which was also out of last 2 years, in the back 2 years. So what is your take on this? And if such policy, which seems to be good, but there is no budgetary allocations, how will it succeed? What can be done about it? What's your take on it?
See, I shouldn't be answering these questions. I'm out of the government. I'm relaxing. People in the government should do that. But let me give you my 2 cents on that. First, I will prioritize. I'll give you an example, clear example. To me, the primary problem in school education, at least, is the teacher. All the recommendations in the book, in the policy regarding teachers, do not require too much of financial investment. So in the first stage, I'll focus totally on that and try and improve the condition of teachers, recruitment of teachers. There are more procedural and institutional rather than financial in nature. So I will go step by step, touch upon such aspects of the policy, which is a very good policy, to implement those where there's not much required. And over a period of time, convince the powers that be that I managed to do what I could do without money. Now give me some more money. That's how it happens. You know, there are no yeses and nos. We all look at it in binaries, 0, 1, nothing in between. Life is not 0 nor 1. It's all in between. So the question is whether you're able to negotiate, you're able to move. And successful people are those that are able to negotiate that 0 to 1.
Thank you, sir.
Vikash Kumar.
Yes, sir. So it was very insightful session, right, with you. And then I was listening your conversation about this ethical dilemma and all. That's very valid, and there's a lot of insight and learning from that. But there's one question in my mind that, before this ethical dilemma, there's also a personal dilemma also. We join the services or any, for that matter, any any job, civil services, or be in the industry and all. We all have human aspirations as well, right? Along with the our responsibility to serve the society. Ethical dilemma is one thing, but like kind of how do we deal with the personal dilemma where our aspirations and what we are supposed to do contradict?
Vikash, you may have to go to counselor for it, but again, whatever little that I can tell you, I'll try and tell you. For me, the bottom line even today is that I will do what I like. What I feel good from deep inside, I'll do that. And I will be prepared to pay a price. Everything has a price. You want to make money, there's a price to be paid. You don't want to make money, there is a price to be paid. So you have to evaluate and see for yourself what you are prepared for in life. Some people ask me, in civil service, you don't even get 1/4 of the salary that you will get in the private sector, which is very good. Join the private sector. I mean, it's a very personal choice that you have to take. Though in my book, not just a civil servant, in the last chapter I write that if I were to be born again, I'd like to be an IAS officer all over. I have reasons for that. But I'm not saying the others who want to join the private sector have made a wrong choice. You have to make a choice and decide. And for heaven's sake, at this stage, and I keep telling you, stop thinking about the society for the time being. अरे इतने ठेकेदार बैठे हैं दिल्ली में ना सोसाइटी के लिए, आप क्यों चिंता कर रहे हैं? देश और सोसाइटी के लिए इतने लोग लगेंगे, आप भी लग जाएंगे, कैसे काम चलेगा? आप सिर्फ I advise youngsters to become selfish. अपने अंदर झांक के देखिए, क्योंकि अपने आप से झूठ नहीं बोलता. जो आपको अंदर से ठीक लगे वो करिए. उसके लिए एक आध सजेशन ले लीजिए किसी से. डिसीजन आपका है, बट बी प्रिपेयर्ड फॉर. इफ यू वांट टू बी डिसऑनेस्ट, be prepared for the possible consequences. You can make money. If you want to remain honest, you may have some problem. Be prepared. Every decision has a price. Don't ever think that this decision will not have a price. There is a cost to everything. So do it with your eyes wide open. I mean, those of you that want to join the civil service, you're most welcome here. You want to reinforce your belief that civil service is the right one to join, read Not Just a Civil Servant. You will understand what I'm saying. But again, it's a personal choice. There are problems here. There are problems with the private sector. Now that I am in the government, I have more idea of to look at the private sector. There are problems there. There are facilities there. So I can't say for sure this is the best. That is, I can say that for myself. I'm very clear in my mind. If I were to be born again, I'd like to be an IAS officer. But I don't know whether it will be true for you. Every individual has its own desires, as you say, aspirations. My aspiration, and since we are again running out of time, I could have narrated to you an incident where I write in my book, I received a number of so-called Bharat Ratnas in my career. And that's what makes me believe that this is the service for me. Because the kick that I got as a consequence of what I did makes me thrilled even today. No amount of money would make me thrilled that. So it's a question of whether you get thrilled by that. Some people may not get thrilled. तो क्या बेकार की बात कर रहे हैं, गरीब आदमी की आपने हेल्प कर दी, उस ओल्ड लेडी ने आपको दुआ दे दी, उससे आप खुश हैं. अब सरकार अपना तरीका है. I can't say that you should like that. I was kicked when an old lady on the deathbed blessed me and the scheme RSPY. She said, ऊपर वाले जाके एक बात जरूर कहूंगी, तुम्हारी स्कीम बहुत अच्छी है. I mean, I was personally shocked, pleasantly shocked. I still get goosebumps. It's narrated in my books. Thank you very much, Kalyan, and my gratitude to Professor Pradhan and Professor Gupta. Proud to have people like you in XLRI. I'm glad you appreciate what I said. And I must confess that the nature of questions were very high quality questions.